So you know what we're looking at. We're looking at exploratory research and trying to figure out how people come up with ideas for projects and trying to, I guess, mine people's experiences and their advice for things that might be useful for other scholars, particularly younger scholars who are looking around for maybe for their dissertation topic or for their first book. So I'll ask you some questions, but this is an open-ended interview, and you should feel free to dilate or digress in whatever direction you like.
Okay.
And stories are good, so give us details on particular projects or from your life whenever it seems appropriate.
All right.
Okay. So my first question is about your approach to finding topics. Is there a particular method, formal or informal that you use, or how would you describe it when you think back to all the papers and books that you've written?
Well, I think what really drives me is a set of questions that have been pretty much the same questions since I started thinking about my dissertation, which really have to do with the relationship between citizens and subjects, their governments, their organizations that for which they work or against which they are trying to express something. Organizations and governments that extract and ask for compliance from members. And so thinking about that set of issues has raised a series of pretty precise questions about organizational forms and about the conditions under which citizens or subjects are more willing to comply voluntarily or quasi-voluntarily. And then what I've done is, as each question or particular set of questions that I want to answer reveals itself to me, I try to find a way to empirically study it that actually gives some leverage on answering the question and in terms of explaining what accounts for the variation and what the mechanisms are for that kind of compliance and consent. And creation of a different kind of ethics and organizational approach. And so, even though my projects in a way look quite different from each other, I mean, they're substantively quite varied, so I haven't focused just on unions or just on revenue extraction or just on conscription, but all of them are actually related in that there's one common theme running through almost all of my work in terms of trying to understand that relationship between governing organizations and those that they govern and how the governed respond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. And if I might just ask you about the antecedent cause here, how did you come to that particular guiding question? Can you recall that time in your life and what was going on?
Well, I think it's the guiding question that has been affecting me almost since I was a child. It had to do with the civil rights movement and the conditions under which people express dissent from government. I mean, my mother was taking us out on demonstrations when we were little. My father was giving us stuff to read that was certainly dissident in a whole variety of ways. I got involved politically very, very young. I joined the Students for a Democratic Society when I was still in high school and was involved in the decision to by the Students for a Democratic Society when I was in college to come out against the war in Vietnam. So those kinds of questions about when citizens will comply and when they will dissent have been sort of part of my upbringing, part of what has made me a human. So I continually explored as I was in college and even in graduate school what it was that I wanted to study, and I thought initially to be very practical and to do things that would affect policy. So my first foray in graduate school was in regional and urban planning, before I switched back to political science. But this question, as a theoretical question that has real world implications, but isn't policy, kept just taking me over.
Mm-hmm.
And so I finally gave in sometime in graduate school, still sort of exploring how to answer it in a way that would also have some practical implications. So my dissertation was on, I was in urban politics as a graduate student in political science. And it was only after I came to the University of Washington that I really became a full-blown comparative political economist as a result of my interactions with mostly Doug North, but also with Michael Hector, a prominent sociologist.
Mm-hmm. And so, if I might, yes, it's true that everyone who lived through the '60s, or let's say, went to an institution of higher education during the '60s, sort of was imbued with some sense of there's a problem of authority, and we
Right.
really need to figure this out. But maybe what was unique about your approach is that you then married that to a social choice theoretical framework.
Right. I wouldn't call it social choice because I'm not formal enough. I mean, social choice, I really identify with Kenneth Arrow and
Okay.
a level of math that I can't do.
Well, the Douglas North version of yeah.
Yeah, so it was rational choice,
Mm-hmm.
and which I do distinguish a little bit. Sorry to be pedantic about it, but the math isn't as essential
Right.
for rational choice. And it was so. What really happened was, and it had happened earlier than the meeting with Doug North. It actually, I'd say, another major influence on my thinking, at least the economics part of my thinking, was Edward Banfield, who was one of my professors at Harvard. And I took a political economy seminar with him, and I fell in love with that work, and that way of thinking about problems, and didn't quite know fully what to do with it, though I used it even in my dissertation. But when I discovered Doug North, when he and I became pals, he gave me an approach, or helped me form an approach that made sense to me, that was both using economic models, though not fully neoclassical ones, to say the least. He was a critic of them, as was I, of the fully neoclassical variant. But it also allowed me to think about new ways of pushing rational choice thinking. So I always believed that people were imperfect decision makers and that they were social beings and that they had ethics. And none of that was clearly embodied in the underlying assumptions of rational choice theory. So part of what I was doing was using my work to push those boundaries. So I was both rational choice and something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about a particular book of yours, which I think we made the center of the survey that you took. That's of Rule and Revenue. And
Correct,
can you
yes.
say a little bit about how that book came about?
Well, that book really evolved. It was my second book, and I was teaching a seminar with Doug North, who, if this becomes a podcast, your listeners should know was a major economic historian who went on to win the Nobel Prize. And Doug and I were teaching an undergraduate seminar in political economy, and students chose to join the seminar only, and they were allowed to join it only if they had taken a series of courses that we had required in both political science and in economics. So it was a relatively small seminar, and a lot of it was me and Doug arguing with each other and exploring things with each other. And he had started to write what became one of his most famous and important books, Structure and Change in Economic History. And it raised all kinds of questions for me. And this was also the period, as you might recall, of the development of a whole variety of neo-Marxist approaches to the
Right.
state, being done by Perry Anderson and Nikos Poulantzas. I could go on and on. There was a long list of people who were really thinking about these questions, and I was part of the Politics and Society editorial board. I may have even been the editor at this point. And of course, we were deeply immersed in that. So I was bringing together in this seminar what I was learning from Doug about neoclassical economics and economic history with what was also inspiring me from another perspective, which was this neo-Marxist and very structuralist approach, which fit with what Doug was also thinking about. It was part of what attracted him to me, as he wanted to relearn some Marxism. So we were trying to put those things together. And as we talked, I realized, I think both of us realized at the same time, that a really important piece of it was thinking about the role of government, and particularly thinking about taxation. And he began to develop a model of taxation and structure and change. And I wasn't totally satisfied with his version, though I was, as I said, very impressed and inspired by it. And so of Rule and Revenue, about the same time he published Structure and Change, I published A Predatory Theory of Rule, which was really the précis of Rule and Revenue, and then went on to write Of Rule and Revenue, really trying to marry these the neoclassical economic perspective with the neo-Marxist perspective, and my understanding that there was something else going on about people having ethical concerns and societal concerns, and not just self-interested concerns. And so that was really what led me to Of Rule and Revenue.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. No. Go ahead.
So then the big problem was how to study it. Because what I was really wanted to understand was why different governments chose different extractive tax regimes over history and over time, and what accounted for their choice and their success. And that meant I needed some kind of data on these issues. And I wanted, being a good neo-Marxist of the time, I wanted to look at different modes of production. So I wanted to start with the ancient mode of production. And that was problematic because fascinated as I was with the Greeks, it turns out there wasn't a lot of evidence about the Greek tax system.
Yeah.
or revenue production system. But I found a series of books and studies in French, which I could read, German, which I could not read, but I could find some translations, and English of the Roman Republic. And so I ended up using that material, to the dismay of a couple of Roman historians that I talked to, because they didn't use my terminology at all. Like state didn't mean anything to them in such a situation. But it allowed me to explore that period of time. And then I went on and did the same with other modes of production, picking an interesting case in each where I had enough evidence, data, if you will. It was hardly the kind of hard data that you could do a regression analysis on, but it was the kind of data which I could do an analytic narrative on, though it was a term that I developed with others later. But it was really the kind of method I was using a game theory model to sort of inform what I was doing, and then looking for testable implications and trying to find evidence that would disprove my preferred hypothesis through the testable implications. So if I couldn't find things that would be implied by the model, there was something wrong with my argument. And if I could find evidence that was contrary to what I should be able to find, that would also disprove my argument. So it's sort of a proof of concept argument, which is a lot of what my work is, rather than I can absolutely affirmatively prove it. The other thing I really learned in that book was, because of the influence of Doug, and Yoram Barzell and Steve Chung, economists at the University of Washington, who were all really important in helping to develop transaction cost theory. I was assuming that I started by assuming that the major reason that you would see variation in different organizational forms of taxation and revenue extraction had to do with economic transaction costs. Where was it cheapest to extract, most efficient to extract revenues? And in fact, I found that it wasn't economic costs that were determinative, but political costs. And that led me to the notion of quasi-voluntary compliance. There were laws in place enforcing compliance, but I perceived that for a system to really work, a significant proportion of the taxed population had to willingly comply with the extractive requests, because they believed that government was relatively trustworthy, i.e., that the money would actually go to what it was supposed to go to, that it was that it made its decisions according to whatever the standards of fairness were of the time and the place and the population that was being affected. And finally, that there was enough confidence in government's capacity to find and punish free riders that you could, with some confidence or some reasonable understanding that would happen, that you were willing to comply if you were so inclined, knowing that you wouldn't be a sucker for doing so.
Great. Yeah, well, it's, an enormously influential book, and something I keep looking back at as I work on my own projects. I want to ask about how you made a note of the fact that your work has really spanned a lot of different topics and time periods. Are you, like, what I'm thinking about, what is the function of looking at very different empirical terrains? Is it that you can kind of stretch the scope conditions of the theory, or how does it come about that you move, let's say, to labor unions from states?
Yeah, as I said, what really drives it is every book or every major project that I've done has ended with a series of questions I couldn't answer, or couldn't answer with the material that I had. So, and at some point, and I think this is important for graduate students to hear and young faculty, at some point you give up. You just stop and you say, I've raised a lot of questions. I've answered some of them that I've raised, and the next ones will just have to be answered by a different project, conceived a somewhat different way. And that's what happened with. So each of the other major projects is really answering a somewhat different question that flows from the same big set of questions. So I'll come to the labor union book in a minute, but the next book was Consent, Dissent, and Patriotism. So which looks at conscription and at volunteering for military service and compelled military service, and why we see different responses to it from citizens at different periods of time over 6 countries. Spans 200 years. And I looked at that question not because I was deeply interested in military service, but because I needed a case. As I said, what I discovered in Of Rule and Revenue, there was a political transaction costs were doing the work, and that there seemed to be this thing called quasi-voluntary compliance. But I couldn't look at it directly by looking at how rulers and their entourage were making decisions about revenue extraction, which is how I framed Of Rule and Revenue. So I can only look at some limited responses. And I didn't have any kind of detailed evidence about it. And it was going to be very hard to get evidence on the real reactions to revenue extraction because there's so many reasons for people to hide what their wealth or income really is and to evade taxes and do all kinds of things. So, tax paying is and it's very hard to get that information from governments or to go back in time enough to get it. But with conscription and with volunteering for military service, that's a public act, at least in aggregate. I couldn't always get the individual statistics, but I could get the aggregate statistics, and I could get them, regionally divided, so that I could really get a sense of where there was some variation in response according to something that might affect the willingness to comply or to consent. And so that's why I shifted to military service, because it really allowed me to get at how political transaction cost worked and what were the mechanisms of actual behavioral compliance and behavioral consent. And that and the next big project was the project I did with Karen Cook and the now deceased Russell Hardin, a political theorist, on trust, and trustworthiness, which we did for the Russell Sage Foundation, and led to a series of books and articles and edited books, but also a co-authored book by me, Karen, and Russell called Cooperation Without Trust, which was really looking at the conditions under which, at least my part of it, which was the more having to do with state organizations, was really looking at the conditions under which governments demonstrated their trustworthiness or reliability, and under which those who were asked to trust them and then behave on that trust, how they came to hold that sense that government was in fact trustworthy, or organizational leadership was trustworthy. And at about the same time, I became the Harry Bridges Chair in Labor Studies at the University of Washington, which got me fascinated with this union, the Longshore Workers Union, the International Longshore Workers Union, which was continually throughout its then 80-year effective history. I mean, it had actually started long before, but under the leadership of Harry Bridges, when it broke away from the East Coast Union and really became a definitive union in its own right, how it was regularly engaging in actions that made no sense from an economistic narrow view of union perspective. It was asking members to engage in costly actions that could potentially lose them their jobs or certainly some pay, and which were on behalf of very far distant others who couldn't reciprocate. And that fed into my interest, which was, I think, in all the work that I'd done, and was most explicit in consent, dissent, and patriotism when I talk about ethical reciprocity. In thinking about what it is that evokes an ethical stance from individuals within an organizational or state framework. Under what conditions does John F. Kennedy's plea to give service really become something that makes sense? So it was going beyond compliance and thinking about, but linked to volunteering, and really thinking about in the military, and really thinking about when it was that people were willing to engage in costly actions. And what it was about organizational structures that could evoke that from people and reinforce it. So I wasn't looking at martyrs or individual ethics, but really about governance structures that would elicit that kind of commitment or behavior. And I saw unions as, and John Alquist, my co-author, agreed with this. I mean, we wrote the book together. Um, we really saw these unions as a way of looking at governments in a tractable form. So again, what I've always been looking for is a way to get at a very complex problem, but find some empirical material that would allow me to identify mechanisms and explanations that were susceptible to a combination of using game theory and rich historical narrative. As I said, the analytic narratives approach, which I had also written
Yeah.
a book on
Yeah.
that, as you know, co-authored a book. I
Well,
did not write it alone. There were four others, very prominent
absolutely, and
voices
an
in that
extremely
discussion.
influential book for sure. Um, Let me ask about advice you might have, or advice that you proffer to students, especially graduate students who are looking for topics and maybe floundering a little bit. Is there a technique or specific suggestions that you have for people who are a little, obviously very bright, but maybe a little lost when it comes to finding that creative spark or that next topic?
Well, one of the things that worries me, and it's worried me my whole career, frankly, is that there's always some method that is trending. Um, right now it's some variant of causal inference, and randomized controlled trials is one expression of it. When I started graduate school, it was probably, it might have been survey research or maybe regressions. I can't even remember. And that tends to define problems for a lot of students. And I would steer away from that. The methods are tools. And what you really want is a puzzle and then figure out whatever tools are best for answering that puzzle. I mean, unless you are a methodologist and you're improving the methods themselves, I don't want to steer those students away from that. But if you're, if you think you're a comparativist or a political economist or an Americanist, I think and certainly a political theorist, I think what you really want is to delve deep inside yourself about what puzzle out there. Just really, you want to figure out what is going on, and then find a piece of it that you might actually be able to make some contribution to, even if it's small. Because I think knowledge is a collective enterprise. So I think the other mistake we make is thinking that everything we have to do is major. And in fact, often it's incremental and it's contributory and it's part of a larger whole. So you want to be in constant conversation with others, but you want to find a puzzle that really
Right,
helps you
right,
move the
right, right.
conversation along.
And sort of an extension of that question is, when we look at our colleagues, I think we can all agree there are some who are just extraordinarily fecund in the sense that they've constantly got new exciting projects, and others that they don't find that. They're just as smart, but they don't. So there's something that differentiates those really productive creative people from the rest. And I'm not sure exactly if I'm just asking the same question in a different format, but I wonder if you could address that. What do I think?
What do you think?
Well, Jay and I are writing this book because we're not quite sure what the answer is. We're not sure if creativity can be taught, if it's sort of an attitude, a way of thinking, a way of living, or what. It's something. It's very ineffable, isn't it? Um,
Well, I think it involves a little risk taking, and it can involve some, you know, almost all the people that I have most admired, even though they've almost all ended up doing extremely well professionally, have gone through some period when they were considered marginal, or including me, um, or given a very hard time professionally because they were trying something that was a little offbeat. So I think that, Doug North used to tell me that he was not the smartest person in most rooms he was in, but he was willing to ask questions and try things that most people weren't. And I think that's a lot of it. It's sort of a willingness to take risk and an enthusiasm for exploring. It's really the excitement of discovery. And I'm not sure imagination. I mean, there are a couple people who just have extraordinary. I mean, not very few of us are Mozarts, but there are a lot of us who are, reasonably productive, imaginative, creative scholars who move the discipline along. And I think most of that comes from risk taking and enthusiasm.
When you,
Enthusiasm for discovery.
read the newspaper or interact with colleagues, are you the sort of person who's constantly thinking of, oh, that's a researchable topic, or that there's one, or do you tend to you have a new idea every year or so, and it's a really good one?
I think I've had one idea.
Okay.
I keep exploring it, and I explore it in different ways. And there have been tweaks to that idea, but I really think if you look at the body of my work, there's
Uh-huh.
like one big set of drivers in there that has to do with this one question that I'm still just trying to figure out. And it brings in other things. I mean, so it's impossible to think about the question that I'm absorbed with without thinking about how do states work? What's their evolution? What makes leadership? Uh, why do citizens believe the things that they believe? And how do we shift beliefs and evoke a better understanding of the world and then a capacity to act on it? So different questions keep coming up, but they're sub questions of the larger issue. In order to answer it, I have to keep asking new questions. That makes sense. So when I read the newspaper, yeah, or when I read books, it's like, oh, that's interesting. I could add that to, I got to think about that. I've got to worry about that. Or, boy, that is
Yeah.
so wrong. Uh, and why do I think it is so wrong? And that helps me so I'm constantly in conversation, I think, with whatever I'm reading. And I'm constantly in conversation with a whole bunch of people who have been important to me over the years, whether it be my mother and my father, or Doug North, or I'm writing a little piece right now with Deborah Satz, who's a philosopher. So her voice is in my head right now as I'm reading things and doing things. Barry Weingast, I'm in regular conversation with, both in person and in my head. And so it goes.
Do you have,
those conversations are
I
endless.
guess, maybe a close cadre of friends and colleagues who you go to first with a new idea to bounce off? Oh, here's a brainstorm I have. Is it worth pursuing? What do you think?
I think, yeah, to some extent. So I mentioned Barry. He's one of them I talk to all the time. We bounce things off of each other, and as you know, we write together on occasion, and are thinking about and are doing some things together right now. There are two young program directors at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science, Betsy Rajala and Federica Caragatti. And I bounce things off of them regularly, just as they bounce things off of me. John Alquist is constantly in my head and often present or on the phone or on email. So I would say a lot of things that I do, are in some ways John and I are, I mean, yes, I bounce things off of John and he bounces things off of me all the time. So those are some of them. In a funny way, as I said, I bounce things off of
Is that
people
right?
who are no longer here as well.
Yeah.
So their ideas are right there for me, and they include people like Doug, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
also Ed Banfield
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
others. Peter Backrack, who was my professor as an undergraduate. I don't think I go through a day without thinking about non-decision making, which was a huge influence on the way in which I think about the world. All the ways in which
Right.
people can't
Right. Yeah.
express voice.
Absolutely. I think I know what you mean. And when you have an idea for a book or an article, do you I don't know, like how do you first articulate it? Do you write out some prose? Do you talk it through with a friend, or sketch it out as as a picture? Hmm.
I write out prose. I think that's the first thing I do. I play with prose, go back and forth with it, with myself and the voices in my head, and then I'll run it by somebody. And I run things. I mean, I love giving presentations of work in
Hmm.
progress, and I love being told it's a goofy idea. And there are things I've dropped because I'm convinced it is a
Yeah.
goofy idea,
So
or I
you're
can't
not
figure out
afraid
how
to
to
go
get
up
at
in
it.
front of an audience and put out an idea that is fairly preliminary without a lot of empirics.
No, I'm not. But then remember, I am now a full professor and well honored. So my risk taking has probably gone up, if anything. But I think I've always done that. I had colleagues who would refuse
Yeah.
to share anything until it was finished, and some of them were brilliant, and the work was great. But often it hurt them. I think they didn't get feedback that would have made it even better, and they didn't. There's something that I think the other thing for students and young faculty to keep in mind is doing that kind of thing. You make friends and allies. One of the things you want to do is be part of a community. It's one how you learn, but it's also
Right.
how your ideas begin to
Yeah,
diffuse.
I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, I totally agree that we should use those opportunities, whatever conference, workshop, seminar, to present works, our thinking on a subject, even if it's at a very early stage, because that's when feedback is most useful. And that's when that live kind of back and forth is most creative. On the other hand, I feel like sometimes I've gone out there too soon and people walk away shaking their heads thinking, Garing, where's he coming from, right? There's a certain reputational cost that,
Right. Well, obviously, you don't go out with such a totally half baked idea. I mean, you have to think it through a little bit first. But I mean, things are often. There are things where I have presented and I've realized in the presentation that it just shouldn't go any further. I was doing a major, and I'm glad I did that. And they weren't stupid ideas. I mean, I didn't lose reputation
mhm,
for it. They were well developed enough to present,
right,
but not so developed that I
right,
couldn't back off from it. And I think that's a crucial moment. Because we get into our own. It's good to get the feedback
yeah,
because we only have limited time, and if a project is really not ready yet, I mean, sometimes a project just gets laid to rest, and you come back to it when you figure out how to do it, and that's what you've
yeah.
learned,
Well,
that you haven't quite
I guess
got
what I'm
the
saying is that I
what you
think there
need.
does need to be a place for presenting exploratory work that is really exploratory. And I know when you get invited to give a talk, they often say, "We want to hear what you're working on now, not what you did last year." But then you show up and you tell them what
I
you're
think,
working on now,
yeah.
and it's like they jump all over you. And there's something, I don't know, a little bit discouraging about that. That
Well, I think that's right. So I think that one of the things that's important to do for those kinds of things is it can't be. totally exploratory work. On the other hand, people do want to hear something other
Right.
than what they can usually than what they've read. But the other thing
That's
to keep in
true.
mind is mostly they haven't read what you've written.
Right.
So sometimes you just give what you just wrote. But I think the other thing, John, is that one of the things we did at the University of Washington, I'll admit to have been instrumental in this, was we set up a discussion group. I think what do we call it? PEDS, Political Economy Drinks and Discussion Society. And it happened at my house, and then it floated around after that for a while. And graduate students and faculty attended over beer, and we presented literally work in progress. And so it was fairly low.
Yeah. Yeah.
You weren't hurting yourself, right? These were in principle your friends and colleagues. You weren't going real public with it. And it was filled with graduate students who also presented their work and got some confidence in their ability to
Right.
do that in
Yeah.
a
We
fairly
need more
low
safe
cost
spaces like
setting.
that. I really believe
So
that.
those, yeah, I mean, Harvard does that. I mean, a lot of places do that. And they're
Absolutely.
really important for
Absolutely.
training graduate students. And they're often cross-disciplinary. Ours was political
Wow.
science,
And
economics,
that worked.
sociology, and philosophy. There'd be maybe 10 or 12 people who would show up, and it would be some of the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
and some
I love
different.
the interdisciplinary idea, but my experience is it doesn't, it takes the right people for that to work. Yeah. Let me
Yeah, well,
sort of shift gears a little bit. Are there areas of political science or adjacent fields that you feel are really underexplored, that are ripe for discovery or rediscovery? You weren't expecting that, were you?
um, well, I mean, there's stuff I'm working on now, which I think a lot more. Would hope a lot more people would work on, um, which has to do with really rethinking the political economic framework under which we currently live. So, I mean, a bunch of books that have recently come out that are thinking about the future of capitalism. Most of them have been by economists. A few, like the new Iverson and Soskis book or the new Bosch book, are by political scientists, and I'm just starting them now. But this is not a space we want to give over only to economists. I mean, I really think thinking about and generating a new political economic framework and thinking about the next stage of capitalism is a critical area for political scientists and for philosophers, because we have to think about what the values are that should be implicated and embodied in the framework. So we talk about it. The CASPAS project is on a moral political economic framework, so as to make the values themselves explicit. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done about, and I see bits and pieces of it, but it's not treated as a major effort in political science as of yet. Though, as I said, there's some really interesting. Kathy Thielen's working on bits of it, for example, to really think about how we restructure government. What are the kinds of governance arrangements that
Sounds
would
a little
work
bit like a long running
in
seminar
the
at
future?
Harvard that I think Peter Hall led for a while. Right.
Yeah, well, the varieties of capitalism work is linked to this, obviously. And as I just mentioned, in the Iverson and Soskis book, it was Hall and Soskis wrote Varieties of Capitalism. So that's linked to it, but it's really, I'd like to see more of that. It had its sort of moment, and then it went into very detailed studies of particular national governments, the varieties of capitalism, and various forms of existing systems, And I think we need to understand more of the dynamics of change and
Yeah,
where we're going and how we
I've been
mold
thinking
where we're
about
going.
the if we are undergoing some kind of IT driven productivity revolution, and I know this is highly debated among economists, but let's say for the sake of discussion that we are, it means that there will be fewer and fewer jobs, good paying jobs. And either will devolve into some kind of gross inegalitarian society where just a few people monopolize all the wealth, or government will play an increasing role in redistributing not just wealth, but also maybe jobs as a job provider. And it means that the role of politics will
Yeah.
grow even more, like magnitudes greater than the role that it now plays as a sort of adjunct to the economy.
Well, I think that is one of the potential possibilities, and I think we should be spending a lot more time thinking about what the various, where what we're seeing happening right now might go. I mean, there are a number of roadmaps there that are possible, and being prepared for the different uh, transformations that might take place. At the least, we're seeing major disruptions. We're certainly seeing that our models that were built on manufacturing and industry are no longer sufficient for a more technology driven economy. We're seeing that our old views of globalization are problematic. So we really have to think about different roles of international, how we think about international
Mm-hmm.
trade and exchanges of people, of products, etc. And I just don't think enough. As I said, there's some work going on this, so I do not want to in any way devalue what is been done and is
Yeah,
being done.
yeah,
But I
yeah. I
think there
agree.
could be a lot
Yeah.
more
All
attention
right.
put to these questions. And
Absolutely.
they're deeply
Absolutely.
political and deeply governmental questions in the end, as well as having a strong
Yep.
economic
Yep.
component and a
Absolutely.
strong
Yeah. It sounds
value
like
and ethics component.
a good opportunity for interdisciplinary thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, that's what we're trying to
Fantastic.
do at the Center
Well, thank
for
you so
Advanced Study.
much. This
But
has been fabulous. If there's any other thoughts you have on this general idea of exploratory research, well, dot dot dot. Now's your chance.
uh, well, I think most of what I'm thinking about right now really fits into this realm. I mean, I think there's some other issues that I think certainly deserve more exploration. Uh, as I said, I sort of started in my mind thinking about the real world, as it were, and went
Hmm.
into high theory and long history. Um, and now it's sort of as I'm in my more senior years, thinking again about policy applications. And another big project that we're running at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences really has to do with how to improve the capacity of political scientists, economists, and others who are engaging and thinking about how to evaluate policy, so that we know that it really had the impact that it was supposed to have. And we've been running a series of workshops and boot camps and seminars that bring policy people in government together with high end statistical and methodological types from the social sciences to really think about how they can improve how we can get how we can get the social scientists to really think about how to improve their methods and their teaching to prepare students to actually help with governmental projects, whether it be the behavioral insight units or the policies that King County, which is Seattle, are engaged in around the transportation system. And, so it's really about rethinking teaching as well as rethinking methods. and what are really useful methods for this kind, using administrative data perhaps rather than randomized controlled trials. There's also a whole series of explorations going on, which I think are really important, about data sharing between firms and universities and how that is, and researchers, and how that's best done in the interest of both while protecting the privacy and security of those who are actually providing the data. And that leads into a whole other set of questions which we've been exploring, which really have to do with who owns that data. As we develop these new technologies, what are the societal consequences and ethical implications of what we're doing?
Absolutely.
So I think that's
fantastic.
a whole big body of questions
Great
to be
hear
explored.
that you're on the job. Well, yeah. Thanks again. This is great stuff for us, and really appreciate your time.